أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد الأمين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين آمين. Dear respected viewers, thank you so much for joining us once more on this your live show from the holy city of Karbala. It is indeed the night of Thursday, and so the dear viewers will of course be in my du'as at the very least, and inshallah ta'ala in the du'as of the rest of the brothers who work in the building of Qanat IMAM Hussein, the IMAM Hussein channel, particularly the English department. And of course, we're back on your live show, back to the basics. I am your host, Yahya Seymour, and we are continuing, and inshallah ta'ala, hopefully, with the blessings of Allah Azza wa Jal, and inshallah ta'ala with the blessings of this night, we shall be able to get through and finalize our discussion on atheism tonight in order that we can begin a new topic for next week. Of course, we had been discussing, for those of you who have not been tuning in, the concept of the Fitrah. And we had alluded to what I think are good indicators that the concept of a Fitrah is indeed a genuine one. That there is a level of self-deception in those who claim not to know of Allah's existence. Now, of course, there are those who have attempted to say that yes, it's true, the average person does believe in God, but evolution has casted this onto us as a crutch in order for us to survive, because to believe in God allows for a higher rate of survival and provides with things like community cohesion, in the same way that magic and totem poles once provided this in pre-civilization's history. Now we have the concept of religion that binds a community together, and it's a very effective device, which is of course just a product of what evolution has cast onto us as a means of getting us through and giving us a higher survival value. Now, of course, it's an interesting argument. It's certainly one supported by many psychologists that came about in the 20th century. People like Freud, for example, would have believed that this concept of God is an attempt at giving an archetypal father to yourself, and it represents many of the issues that we have with our own parents. Now, it's interesting that is said, because there are those who work in psychology and are believers that have conducted reverse studies and demonstrated that, many of these leading atheists are people that had parental issues and chose to take that out against God. So claims are made on both sides. And what are we going to do with those claims? We have to engage with them. And we have to understand, is it possible that our belief in God is merely something that evolution cast upon us as a useful tool in order to get us out of this Darwinian world of mess by giving us a higher survival rate? Now, my response, or my attempt to engage with this claim, is going to take several forms. Number one, I believe we can reverse these claims and throw them back upon their head. And number two, I believe that if the atheist wants to take this route of saying that we can't trust our belief in God and the fact illusion cast upon us by evolution, it will open up an even bigger can of worms for the atheist. But of course, inshallah ta'ala, let's try and begin systematically. The first argument that is made is that religion is a need that mankind has given himself in order to survive. But if that's the case, this itself gives us an amazing and unique theistic argument. Not one which I claim is as overwhelming as the previous information we've looked at, but I do believe it's nonetheless a pretty surreal argument, and one which gives us a level of confidence that the atheist claim against us is just a load of, dare I say, poppycock, which can be turned back upon its head. When we look at the atheist claim, they would claim something along the lines of, human beings have these empty feelings which give him needs, and in order to cope with that need, he's created religion as a crutch, and the concept of God is a crutch for him to get through life, not being willing to accept the harsh reality of his own loneliness cosmically. So what has essentially been said is that we've created God as a means to cope and as a means to survive, as a crutch, essentially, something that we can lean on in order that life can go forward. Now, it's an interesting concept. If that is the case, then let's look at the following. I think we can all agree that for every natural desire, there is something that exists which correlates to that natural desire. Now let me break down my terms of engagement so we all understand where we are and we're all on the same page, inshallah ta'ala. By the term natural and desire, what I mean is a desire which is innate within the human being. The desire which is innate within every single human being. So if you were to tell me that I naturally desired a red Ferrari, that would not be a natural desire, because the average baby doesn't come out of his mother's womb saying immediately or desiring a red Ferrari. Nor would we even know what a red Ferrari was until it was produced. So it's clearly not a natural desire. A natural desire is something more along the lines of what Patricia Churchland argued was something that human beings have adapted to survive in order to accumulate. So she gave the analogy of the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, food, and reproduction. So let's say that food and reproduction are 2 of the natural desires that human beings normally have. And the third one would be, for example, water, things like sleep. Those are all natural desires. Now, when I have that thirst, there is something that corresponds to my thirst within the outer natural world. There's water that can satiate my thirst. When I get hungry, there is again something within the natural world which can satiate hunger. Many different types of food, many things which are edible, human beings have something that correlates to their natural desire. The third natural desire, reproduction. Of course, there is people that they can get married to. There is something which correlates to that natural desire. What's another natural desire that all human beings have? Comfort and justice. Comfort and justice, and a search for happiness, which no matter how much we struggle, can never be fulfilled in this life. So that's a natural desire that every human being has, unless we're slightly disturbed, because none of us like to see the suffering of other human beings. Then we know that this natural desire must correlate to something which exists. If, however, I observe that there is nothing in this world which correlates to my natural desire for an end of suffering and for comfort, then I know that my natural desire must correlate to something which exists elsewhere, and that, I believe, is the relationship with God, which every believer and every human being is searching for. So that is the first way we're able to turn this argument back upon its head. Now, I've admitted it's not the most convincing of arguments, but for me it's certainly just as convincing as the arbitrary claim that religious people made up God in order to feel better about themselves. So that's firstly. The second claim is, of course, one which is made quite frequently. We are told that believers have no particular evidence for God, and to cite God as a solution for any problem is to not give a solution whatsoever, because it's to essentially say nothing. This is a claim made by some philosophers of science, and they claim that when you cite God as an explanation, you're particularly saying nothing about the truth, because you're citing something that can't be demonstrated. Now, of course, it's been pointed out by numerous philosophers that people in science don't need to provide an explanation for an explanation. That's number one. Number two, let's take this, as has been done by several Muslims, into the form of a particular theological argument. If we believe that everything is just an illusion imposed upon us by evolution, as we have seen several atheists argue religion is, then it leads us into the same dilemma we were talking about earlier as to whether or not we can trust our minds and whether or not our minds are geared towards examining truth. As Charles Darwin has been cited by me on this show numerous times as saying, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value at all or are trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Patricia Churchland likewise states, "Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore, that is to say task, of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensory motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it's geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival." She states, "Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost." That is to say, it's not important for what evolution has in mind. So when we're looking at what a human being looks like as an evolved organism, for those who don't believe in God, we see that Charles Darwin himself, who came up with a very theory of evolution, felt that it allows us, now that we know we are mere cousins, rather, of apes and indeed every other organism. Well, slightly more distant cousins from, say, plankton and other types of plant life, but we are nonetheless all related in some way, shape, or form, and therefore Charles Darwin asks, if we can trust our minds in such a way, why is it that he doubts in the mind of a monkey, if it indeed has such a thing as a mind? And of course, this is a very valid point. If all we are is essentially animals like the monkey, and all that has happened is we have evolved in order to survive unguided, then we cannot trust this thing known as the human mind to give us truth. We can trust it for the 4 F's, as Patricia Churchland states, yes. But can we trust it for truth finding? No, absolutely not. So that's, of course, one way of doubting the mind. The other way of doubting the mind was, of course, Alex Rosenberg's way of saying that because everything is physical and the concept of a thought is not a physical thing, then we have to remove the concept of a thought, and it's merely an illusion cast upon the body, again, by what evolution has given us. Now, one very important argument which needs to be made when discussing with those who argue against God's existence, especially those who talk about evidence all the time, is, can we even analyze evidence if God does not exist? Now, this argument is an interesting one, and it has been expounded upon by both Muslims and Christians. We can call it the argument from the laws of logic. It goes as follows. Premise 1. The laws of logic exist. That is to say that certain logical truths, such as the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity are true. The law of non-contradiction is that something cannot be true and false at the same time. The law of excluded middle is that something is either true or false, there's no middle ground. And the law of identity is that something is what it is. Number 2, the laws of logic are statements about objective reality and cannot be dismissed as subjective. And by that, of course, for those of you that have followed the morality discussion, you'll all know what I mean by objective. That is to say, they must exist externally of the human mind. Premise 3. These logical absolutes, brackets laws, form the basis of rationality and therefore argumentation. And what I mean by that is, namely, if I were to argue with others that it is both day and night at the same time and in the same city, then I would not be taken too seriously. If I could believe that I am both sitting and standing up at the same time right now, you would not be listening to my discourse. And therefore, these laws must form the basis of rationality and therefore any argumentation. Premise 4, they are transcendent. And what I mean by that is they are true regardless of time, space, and the existence of human beings. These laws would be true according to all, and they would be true at any time regardless of whether or not human beings exist. 5, they are in no way, shape, or form dependent upon the physical world. And what I mean by that is that these laws of logic don't require a physical world to be true. What I mean by that is, if we were to live in a world that doesn't have the physicality that we do, it's just a spiritual world, the laws of logic would still remain true. Premise 6, they are conceptual by nature. That is to say, they are thoughts. They have this concept of beyondness, this concept of intelligibility, this concept which Alex Rosenberg denies in his worldview. Premise 7, thoughts require a thinker or a knower, and yet these conceptual laws would be true even without the thinkers and knowers from amongst the human race. Premise 8, these thoughts must therefore exist in the mind of a transcendent, timeless agent who is external to the physical universe. This agent is the theistic concept of a deity, namely God. Now, following up from that, God either exists or he does not, therefore theism or atheism. That is the application of the law of excluded middle. That something is either true or false. The statement God exists is either true or false. Premise 10, upon atheism, there exists zero account or explanatory power to explain the laws of logic, and therefore theism. So we see that the laws of logic, which every rational argument is dependent upon, cannot be observed within the physical world. That is to say, they're not something we can examine under a microscope, nor can we measure it like heat or weight, and therefore they are not physical, they are conceptual. These conceptual laws are required for us to know anything. And if someone tells you that I don't believe in such laws, you can't have a conversation with them, because you could be saying one thing and he could claim you're contradicting yourself. He could claim one thing but then claim the opposite and talk a load of non-rational jargon. Now, of course, he could always argue, as atheists tend to do, for morality, that I don't need to give an account for the laws of logic. The laws of logic just exist. It's a bit like someone coming along and saying that the laws of the nation that you live in just exist, and there never existed someone who compiled the laws. And in fact, even the physical laws of nature and their constant ability to be constant, and the fact that we don't assume that they're going to change the next day out of randomness, requires a theistic explanation as well. So we see, in order for even someone to utilize rationality, they must invoke the concept of God. Now, that's again, I'm not arguing that atheists aren't rational people. Many of them are by far smarter than ourselves. Many of them are really intelligent. Many of them have far more degrees than the average believer. But nonetheless, just because you believe in something, and just because you can use the laws of logic, does not mean you can provide an explanation or account for the laws of logic. By failing to provide an account for the laws of logic, and by failing to be able to account for them within the realm of your materialistic worldview, you have essentially, again, shot yourself in the foot. Now, what we see here is that, according to 3 arguments, 2 put forward by the atheist and 1 put forward by the theist, we see that there's good reason for not trusting our minds if atheism is true. And what are those arguments? The first one is the argument by Dr. Alex Rosenberg in his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, in which he states that the concept of thought, the concept of conceptuality, the ability for us to have this sense of beyondness or aboutness does not exist, because our brain is just a physical object, and physical objects can't be about something else. So it's just an illusion. If that's the case, and everything's predetermined, and my thoughts are all an illusion, then we can't trust our mind. And if that's the case, then we can't have a conversation. The second type of argument put forward by atheists for why we might not be able to trust our minds is that if the evolution process was a blind one, that had no guide, no guiding hand to steer it in the right direction, we would have absolutely zero reason to trust that we can trust this mind. Why? Because evolution is not concerned with fact-finding. It's not concerned with mathematical truths, philosophical truths, or any other type truths. In fact, it doesn't even concern itself with a word called true or a word called false. It concerns itself with what? The 4 F's. You have to survive, so fighting, fleeing, food, and reproduction are the only things which are on the table for you if evolution is indeed an unguided process. So that's the second argument against why we can trust our minds. The third argument for why we can't trust our minds, which again is related to the second argument, is if our mind casts upon us all these false beliefs, such as religion as a surviving crutch, then really can we ever trust that anything we believe is true? This not only takes us out of the realm of trusting our minds, but it makes us believe that the very things we do think we know are all illusions. And it reminds us of theories that we hear from people on the streets, such as everything being a giant conspiracy and a delusion, and we're in a giant matrix, and we're going down a rabbit hole with Alice once again and finding ourselves in Wonderland. Now lastly, you have the argument from the laws of logic, which is put forward by theists, which is that rational thought is dependent upon these 3 laws of logic. These laws are transcendent, they transcend time and space, and they're not physical, and of course they require a thinker or a knower who knows these things. And if the human beings are the only knowers who know these laws, then you're saying that these things would not be true, and essentially there is no account whatsoever for the laws of logic. So dear viewers, we see that when we go down the route of atheism, it leads to absurdity. Now that's not to be offensive to any of our atheist viewers, but this is just something that we wanted to put forward, and has indeed been put forward. And inshallah ta'ala, dear viewers, you've understood the argument. Please join us again in a day's time, in which we'll continue analyzing our worldviews. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.